The gunshot echoed across the plains as Flora Grayson watched her father collapse to the ground, his blood staining the parched earth of their struggling ranch outside Rhyolite, Nevada. The year was 1876, and in that single moment, everything she had known and loved was shattered. The men who had come to collect her father's debt stood over his body, their expressions cold as the winter wind that would soon sweep through the desert. "You've got until sundown tomorrow to clear out," the tallest one said, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco and whiskey. "The Blackwater Mining Company owns this land now." Flora fell to her knees beside her father's body, her 22-year-old heart breaking as she closed his vacant eyes. Thomas Grayson had been a proud man, a hard-working rancher who had fallen on difficult times after 3 consecutive years of drought had decimated their cattle herd. The loan he'd taken to keep the ranch afloat had been his undoing. "I need time to bury him properly," Flora said, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster. Her honey-brown hair had come loose from its pins, framing a face streaked with tears and dust. "Sundown tomorrow," the man repeated, tipping his hat mockingly before he and his companions mounted their horses and rode away. That night, Flora dug her father's grave herself, the blisters on her hands nothing compared to the pain in her heart. By dawn, she had packed what little she could carry: a change of clothes, her mother's locket, her father's old revolver, and what meager funds she could find hidden in the floorboards. $28 would not carry her far, but it would have to be enough. As the sun began its ascent, casting long shadows across the land, Flora took one last look at the only home she had ever known. The ranch house, weathered and worn, had been built by her grandfather. The barn, once filled with horses and cattle, now stood empty. The fields, once green with promise, were barren and dry. With her father's old hat pulled low over her eyes and her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders, Flora mounted her mare, Willow, and rode away from the broken ranch, not knowing where she would go or what would become of her. She only knew that she could not stay. For 3 days, Flora rode across the Nevada desert, sleeping under the stars, rationing her food and water carefully. By the 4th day, Willow was limping, and Flora was forced to dismount and lead her on foot. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Flora's lips cracked from dehydration. Her hope began to wane as her water ran out and the landscape remained unchangingly hostile. On the 5th day, a dust storm blew in from the west, forcing Flora to seek shelter in a shallow cave. Willow whinnied in distress as the sand pelted against them, and Flora held her close, whispering soothing words even as her own fear threatened to overwhelm her. When the storm finally subsided, Flora emerged to find Willow had gone lame, unable to bear her weight any longer. "It's all right, girl," Flora whispered, stroking the mare's neck. "We'll rest here a while longer." But as night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, and Flora found herself shivering, her thin shawl providing little protection against the desert's nocturnal chill. She huddled against Willow for warmth, but it wasn't enough. Her teeth chattered and her fingers grew numb. Just as she was beginning to fear she might not survive the night, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Panic seized her. Had the Blackwater men followed her? Had they come to ensure she wouldn't speak of what they had done to her father? She reached for her revolver, but her frozen fingers couldn't grip it properly. The figure that appeared before her was silhouetted against the star-filled sky, tall and broad-shouldered, unmistakably a cowboy. Flora tried to stand, ready to defend herself if necessary, but her legs gave out beneath her. "Easy there, miss," the stranger said, his voice deep but gentle. "I mean you no harm." As he dismounted and approached, Flora could see his features more clearly in the moonlight, a strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble, a straight nose, and eyes that seemed to hold both wariness and kindness. "Name's Preston Quinn," he said, crouching down before her. "I was tracking a stray from my herd when I saw your horse. You're a long way from anywhere, Miss Flora Grayson," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My horse has gone lame and I've nowhere to go." Preston nodded, studying her face with an intensity that might have made her uncomfortable under different circumstances. "You're half frozen," he observed, removing the saddle from his horse. He pulled out a thick woolen blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Sleep here tonight," he said. "Come morning, we can figure out what to do." The warmth of the blanket and the unexpected kindness of this stranger brought tears to Flora's eyes. "Thank you," she managed to say. Preston built a small fire, careful to keep it controlled so as not to attract unwanted attention. He offered her jerky and a canteen of water which Flora accepted gratefully. As she ate, she watched him tend to Willow, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he examined the mare's injured leg. "She'll need rest," he said after a while, "and proper care, but she should recover." "I don't have money to pay you," Flora admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. Preston looked at her with surprise. "I didn't ask for payment, Miss Grayson." "Why are you helping me then?" Flora asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Preston sat down across from her, the fire between them casting flickering shadows across his face. "My pa raised me to help folks in need," he said simply. "And out here, refusing to help someone is as good as condemning them to death." Flora nodded, understanding the harsh truth of his words. In the wilderness of the West, survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. "I'm grateful," she said. "Truly." As the night deepened, Preston told her about his small cattle operation a few miles to the east. He had inherited it from his father, who had died 2 years prior. He ran it with the help of 2 ranch hands, Mexican brothers who had been with the Quinn family for over a decade. "It's nothing fancy," Preston said, "but it's honest work, and the land is good." Flora found herself drawn to the sincerity in his voice, the lack of pretense. When she finally felt comfortable enough, she told him about her father's death, the debt, and her forced flight from the only home she had ever known. Preston's expression darkened as she spoke of the Blackwater Mining Company. "They've been buying up land all over these parts," he said. "Or taking it, more like. They found silver in the mountains to the north, and now they're hungry for every acre they can get their hands on." "They murdered my father," Flora said, her voice breaking. "Shot him down like he was nothing." Preston's jaw clenched. "I'm sorry, Miss Grayson." "That's not right, not by any measure." Flora pulled the blanket tighter around herself, fighting back tears. "I don't know what I'm going to do now. I have no family, no money, no skills except those of a rancher's daughter." Preston was quiet for a long moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. "My place isn't much," he finally said, "but there's room for you if you've a mind to stay for a while. At least until your mare is healed and you've had time to think on your next move." Flora looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but she found only genuine concern. "Why would you offer such kindness to a stranger?" "Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything," Preston said, his gaze shifting to the fire. "When my ma died, Pa nearly drank himself to death. We almost lost the ranch. If it hadn't been for neighbors stepping in, helping us through that hard time, I wouldn't be here now." Flora nodded, understanding. The West was a place of harsh realities and unexpected mercies. "I'll stay," she said, "but only until Willow is healed, and I'll work to earn my keep." Preston smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his rugged features. "That's fair," he said. "We can always use another pair of hands at the double Q." As the night wore on and the fire burned low, Flora felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, despite all that had happened. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the presence of this quiet, steady man who had appeared like a guardian angel in her darkest hour. Whatever it was, she slept that night, wrapped in his blanket, with the first real sense of security she had felt since her father's death. When morning came, Preston helped Flora mount his horse while he led Willow by the reins. The journey to the Double Q Ranch took most of the day, with Preston pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the land they traversed. Flora found herself drawn to his deep knowledge of the terrain. The way he spoke of the desert, not as an enemy, but as a complex, living entity deserving of respect. The Double Q came into view as the sun began its descent, a modest ranch house with a barn, corral, and bunkhouse nestled in a valley protected by low hills. A stream ran through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that provided blessed shade. It wasn't large, but it was well maintained, a testament to Preston's care and hard work. Two men emerged from the barn as they approached the Mexican brothers Preston had mentioned, Miguel and Javier Ortiz. They greeted Preston with easy familiarity and looked at Flora with curious but respectful eyes. "This is Miss Flora Grayson," Preston explained. "She'll be staying with us for a time. Her mare is injured and she needs a place to recuperate." The brothers welcomed her warmly, Javier taking charge of Willow with a promise to give her the best care possible. Miguel offered to show Flora to a room in the ranch house, but Preston intervened. "Miss Grayson can take my room," he said. "I'll bunk with you boys for a while." "That's not necessary," Flora protested. "I don't want to displace you." "It's no trouble," Preston insisted. "A lady needs her privacy." Flora wanted to argue further, but exhaustion overtook her. The emotional and physical toll of the past few days crashed down upon her all at once, and she swayed on her feet. Preston steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "You need rest," he said softly. "Everything else can wait until morning." Too tired to resist, Flora allowed herself to be led to Preston's room, a simple but clean space with a bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk. A window overlooked the corral, and the walls were adorned with a few framed photographs and a rifle rack. "Thank you," Flora said, standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, "for all of this." Preston nodded, his expression unreadable. "Get some sleep, Miss Grayson. You're safe here." As he closed the door behind him, Flora sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by his kindness. The scent of him lingered on the pillow, leather, soap, and something uniquely masculine. She hadn't intended to cry, but the tears came unbidden, a release of fear and grief and relief all mingled together. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Flora awoke the next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the events of the past week came flooding back, and she remembered where she was and how she had come to be there. She rose and used the basin of water someone had thoughtfully placed on the dresser to wash her face and hands. Her reflection in the small mirror revealed a face still marked by fatigue, but no longer haunted by immediate fear. She tidied her hair as best she could and straightened her clothes before venturing out to find the source of the enticing smells. In the kitchen, she found Miguel at the stove, expertly flipping flapjacks while bacon sizzled in a cast iron skillet. Javier and Preston sat at the table, deep in conversation about the day's work ahead. Preston looked up as she entered and his face brightened. "Miss Grayson," he said, rising to his feet. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in days," Flora admitted. "And please call me Flora. Miss Grayson makes me feel like a schoolteacher." Preston smiled, the expression transforming his face, softening the hard angles and bringing a light to his eyes that Flora found herself drawn to. "Flora, then," he said, "and I'm Preston to my friends." "Breakfast is served," Miguel announced, placing a platter of flapjacks and bacon on the table. "Eat well, Miss Flora. You look like you could use some meat on your bones." Flora blushed but took a seat, accepting the plate Preston handed her. The food was simple but delicious, and she realized how hungry she was. For a few minutes, conversation ceased as they all focused on their meals. "I checked on your mare this morning," Javier said eventually. "The leg is strained, not broken. With rest and care, she should recover fully in a few weeks." Flora's relief was palpable. "Thank you. Willow was my father's pride. She's all I have left of him now." A silence fell over the table, respectful and sympathetic. Preston cleared his throat. "Flora has offered to work while she's here," he told the brothers. "I was thinking she might help with the garden and the chickens. The vegetable patch has been neglected since Pa died, and the hens aren't laying as they should." Miguel nodded approvingly. "The land is good here. With proper tending, we could grow much more than we do." "I'm happy to help in any way I can," Flora said. "Though I should warn you, my gardening skills are limited. We focused more on cattle at our ranch." "I can teach you," Javier offered. "My mother was a master gardener. She could make anything grow, even in the desert." After breakfast, Javier showed Flora the garden plot behind the house. It was overgrown with weeds, but the soil was rich, and an irrigation ditch from the stream provided a steady supply of water. "Start with clearing the weeds," Javier advised. "Then we'll see what can be salvaged and what needs to be planted anew." Flora set to work with determination, grateful for the physical activity that kept her mind occupied. The sun was warm on her back as she pulled weeds and turned soil, and the rhythmic nature of the work allowed her thoughts to settle. By midday, she had cleared a significant portion of the garden and discovered several vegetable plants struggling beneath the overgrowth tomatoes, peppers, and beans that had somehow survived neglect. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Preston approaching until his shadow fell across her work area. She looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun, to find him standing with a canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, offering the canteen. "And hungry." Miguel sent some food. Flora accepted both gratefully, suddenly aware of her parched throat and empty stomach. Preston settled on a nearby stump, watching as she drank deeply and unwrapped the bundle to reveal bread, cheese, and dried fruit. "You've made progress," he observed, nodding at the half-cleared garden. "It's good land," Flora said. "With proper care, it could yield plenty." Preston's eyes held a hint of pride. "That's what my pa always said." He had dreams of expanding the garden, making it a real source of income beyond the cattle. But after Ma died, he didn't have the heart for it. Flora heard the undertone of sadness in his voice. "I'm sorry about your mother. It's hard to lose a parent." "She died of consumption when I was 16, Preston said, his gaze distant. "Pa was never the same after. He kept the ranch going, but something in him died with her." Flora nodded, understanding all too well. "After my mother died in childbirth, both she and the baby were lost. My father threw himself into the ranch. It became his whole world, and mine too, I suppose." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, united by shared grief. Then Preston seemed to shake himself from his reverie. "The men from Blackwater," he said. "Would you recognize them if you saw them again?" Flora's hand stilled, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. "Yes," she said, her voice hardening. "I will never forget their faces." "Why do you ask?" Preston's expression grew serious. "They've been pushing boundaries all over the territory, taking land, intimidating folks. The law doesn't do much. The sheriff in Rhyolite is in their pocket, but people are starting to talk about standing together, pushing back. What good would that do? Flora asked bitterly. They have money, men with guns, influence with the law. Sometimes standing up is its own victory, Preston said quietly. My pa taught me that a man who won't stand for what's right isn't much of a man at all. Flora studied his face, seeing the conviction there. You're planning something, she said. It wasn't a question. Preston shook his head slightly. Nothing concrete, just talking with neighbors, feeling out who might be willing to take a stand if it comes to it. And if it does come to it, Flora pressed. What then? Preston met her gaze directly. Then we do what we must to protect what's ours. The intensity in his eyes stirred something in Flora: admiration, certainly, but also a flutter of something more, something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She looked away, focusing on her food. Enough about that for now, Preston said, his tone lightening. Tell me more about this garden. What do you think we should plant? Flora gratefully accepted the change of subject, and they spent the rest of her break discussing crops and growing seasons, the conversation flowing easily between them. When Preston finally rose to return to his work with the cattle, Flora found herself watching his retreating figure with a mixture of curiosity and something that felt dangerously like attraction. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Flora rose early, helped with breakfast, then spent the morning in the garden while the men tended to the cattle and other ranch chores. Afternoons might find her collecting eggs, helping Miguel with dinner preparations, or sitting with Willow, whose recovery was slow but steady. Evenings were spent around the table, or, if the weather permitted, on the porch, sharing stories and watching the stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky. Flora found herself drawn to Preston's quiet strength, his unwavering sense of right and wrong, and the gentle way he treated both animals and people. She caught him watching her sometimes, his expression thoughtful, but he maintained a respectful distance, never overstepping the boundaries of propriety. A month passed, then two. The garden flourished under Flora's care, producing an abundance of vegetables that supplemented their meals and provided enough excess to sell in Rhyolite. Willow's leg healed completely, but Flora found excuses to delay her departure. There was always another crop to plant, more preserving to be done as summer waned, preparations for winter that couldn't be neglected. And if the real reason she stayed was the way her heart quickened when Preston smiled at her, or the comfort she found in their evening conversations, she wasn't ready to admit it, even to herself. One evening in late September, as Flora sat on the porch mending a shirt, Preston joined her, settling into the chair beside hers with a sigh of contentment. The day had been good. A successful cattle sale had brought in needed funds, and the first fall harvest from the garden had been bountiful. You've brought life back to this place, Flora, Preston said after a comfortable silence. The garden, the chickens, even the house feels different, warmer somehow. Flora's hands stilled on her sewing. I've been happy here, she admitted. Happier than I thought I could be after everything. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. You've made a place for yourself. The boys and I, we've come to think of you as family. Family. The word both warmed and unsettled her. Was that all she was to him? A sister figure, a friend? She had begun to hope for more, though she scarcely acknowledged it even to herself. I should probably be moving on soon, she said, testing the waters. Willow's healed and winter will be here before we know it. Preston's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Where would you go? Flora shrugged, looking out at the darkening landscape. I don't know, California maybe. I hear there's opportunity there. You could stay, Preston said, his voice low but steady, if you wanted to. Flora's heart beat faster. As your garden keeper and chicken tender. she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Preston turned to face her fully then, his eyes serious. As whatever you want to be, Flora, to the ranch, to the boys. A pause. To me. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Flora found it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly with him looking at her that way. Preston. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast. Preston was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the gun at his hip. Flora rose too, squinting into the gathering dusk. 3 riders came into view, their horses lathered from hard riding. Flora recognized Miguel's cousin Eduardo among them, a ranch hand from the neighboring Stevens property. "Quinn," Eduardo called as they drew near. "We need help." Blackwater men came to Stevens' place. "They're burning him out." Preston's face hardened. "How many?" "6, maybe more," Eduardo replied, dismounting quickly. "They claim Stevens defaulted on a loan, but it's a lie. They just want his water rights." Preston nodded grimly. "Get Javier and Miguel," he told Flora. "Tell them to bring rifles." He turned to Eduardo. "We'll ride in 5 minutes." As Eduardo and his companions moved toward the barn to water their horses, Preston turned back to Flora. His eyes were dark with determination and something else, regret, perhaps, for the conversation interrupted. "We'll finish our talk when I return," he promised. Flora wanted to protest, to beg him not to go, but she knew it would be futile. This was who Preston was, a man who stood up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. It was one of the things she had come to admire most about him. "Be careful," she said instead, reaching out impulsively to touch his arm. "Please." Preston covered her hand with his own for a brief moment. "I will," he said. Then he was gone, striding toward the barn to ready his horse. Flora found the Ortiz brothers and relayed Preston's message. Within minutes, all 6 men were mounted and riding out, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Flora stood on the porch, watching until they disappeared from view, a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. The night stretched endlessly before her. Flora tried to busy herself with chores, finishing her mending, preparing food for the men's return, checking on the livestock, but her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. The Blackwater men were ruthless. She knew that firsthand. What if Preston was hurt? What if he didn't come back at all? The thought was unbearable. It was then that Flora finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for weeks. She had fallen in love with Preston Quinn. Somewhere between that first night in the desert when he had wrapped her in his blanket and tonight, when he had all but asked her to stay, he had claimed her heart completely. And now he was riding into danger, and she might never get the chance to tell him. The hours crawled by. Flora eventually settled in a chair on the porch, a rifle across her lap, straining to hear any sound of returning riders. It was well past midnight when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. She rose to her feet, heart pounding, the rifle held at the ready in case it wasn't the men returning. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Preston's tall figure leading the group. She counted quickly. All 6 men who had left were returning. But as they drew closer, she could see that something was wrong. Preston was slumped in his saddle, and Javier rode close beside him as if ready to catch him should he fall. Flora raced down the steps, reaching them just as they entered the yard. "What happened?" she demanded, her eyes fixed on Preston. "Ambush," Miguel said grimly. "One of the Blackwater men shot Preston as we were leaving. The bullet grazed his side, but he's lost blood." Preston looked down at her, his face pale in the moonlight. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, though his voice was strained with pain. "Just a scratch." "A scratch that's been bleeding for hours," Javier corrected, dismounting quickly to help Preston down from his horse. Flora moved to Preston's other side. supporting him as they made their way to the house. Up close, she could see the dark stain on his shirt, the tight lines of pain around his eyes. Fear clutched at her heart, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Get him to his room," she instructed. "Miguel, bring hot water and clean cloths. Javier, I'll need whiskey, needle, and thread." The men followed her instructions without question, recognizing the authority in her voice. Within minutes, Preston was lying on his bed, his shirt cut away to reveal a nasty gash along his left side. The bullet had indeed just grazed him, but the wound was long and deep enough to require stitches. Flora worked methodically, cleaning the wound with whiskey, which made Preston hiss through gritted teeth, then carefully stitching it closed. Her fingers were steady, her focus absolute. Only when the task was complete, the wound bandaged and Preston given a measure of whiskey for the pain, did she allow herself to feel the fear she had been suppressing. "Everyone else?" she asked Miguel as they stepped outside Preston's room. "Cuts and bruises only," Miguel assured her. "Stephen's ranch is damaged but not destroyed. The Blackwater men retreated when they saw our numbers." "For now," Flora said darkly. She knew men like that wouldn't give up so easily. "For now," Miguel agreed. "Get some rest, Miss Flora. We'll keep watch tonight." But Flora couldn't rest. She returned to Preston's room, settling into a chair beside his bed. He was sleeping now, his breathing even, his face relaxed in a way it never was when he was awake. Flora allowed herself the liberty of studying him, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow, the dark lashes resting against his cheeks. "I could have lost you tonight," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "And you would never have known how I feel." She reached out tentatively, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm, too warm perhaps, and she frowned, wondering if fever was setting in. She fetched a fresh cloth and basin of cool water, gently bathing his face and neck to bring down the heat. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Preston stirred, his eyes opening slowly to focus on her face. "Flora," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep and pain. "You're still here." "Of course I'm still here," she replied, trying to keep her tone light. "Someone has to make sure you don't tear those stitches." Preston's lips curved into a small smile. "Always practical." Flora dampened the cloth again and pressed it to his forehead. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot," Preston answered dryly. He caught her hand as she withdrew it, his fingers wrapping around hers. "But I'm glad to be home." Home. The word hung between them, filled with meaning. Flora felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away. "I was so afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Preston's grip on her hand tightened. "I had to go, Flora. Stevens has a wife, children. I couldn't let them face Blackwater alone." "I know," Flora said, and she did. It was who he was, a protector, a man of principle. "I wouldn't have expected anything less of you." Preston studied her face, his eyes more intense than she had ever seen them. "Last night before the riders came, we were talking about you staying." Flora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I want you to stay, Flora," Preston said, his voice gaining strength. "Not as my garden keeper or my cook or anything else. I want you to stay as my wife." Flora's breath caught. Despite the hints and near admissions of the previous evening, the directness of his proposal stunned her. "Preston, you're injured and exhausted. You don't know what you're saying." A flash of humor lit his eyes. "I've been shot, not addled. I know exactly what I'm saying, and I've been wanting to say it for weeks." He struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. Flora moved to help him, and suddenly they were face to face, inches apart. Preston released her hand to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "I love you, Flora Grayson," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since that night in the desert. I want to build a life with you, tend the garden, raise cattle, maybe have children someday." I want to see you sitting on the porch every evening when I come in from the range. I want to grow old with you." Tears spilled down Flora's cheeks now, unchecked. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was so scared I'd never get to tell you." Preston smiled, tender and triumphant all at once. "Is that a yes?" Flora laughed through her tears. "Yes, Preston Quinn. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll be your wife." Preston closed the distance between them then, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both gentle and fervent, a promise and a fulfillment all at once. Flora melted into him, careful of his injury but unable to resist the pull that had been drawing them together for months. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I should get shot more often if this is the result," he murmured. Flora pulled back, giving him a stern look. "Don't you dare. Once was quite enough, thank you." Preston chuckled, then grimaced as the movement aggravated his wound. "Noted," he said. "Though I can't promise I won't face Blackwater again. They won't stop with Stevens." Flora nodded, serious now. "I know. But next time we face them together, the Graysons know a thing or two about fighting for what's ours." Preston's eyes shone with pride and love. "Together then," he agreed. "Always." Flora sealed the promise with another kiss, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. From the moment she had fled her broken ranch with nothing but grief and fear as her companions, to this moment of finding love and purpose in the most unexpected place, her journey had been one of loss and discovery. And now, with Preston by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, once Preston's wound had healed enough for him to stand comfortably through the ceremony. It was a simple affair, held on the ranch with just a handful of guests: the Ortiz brothers, Eduardo and his family, the Stevens, and a few other neighboring ranchers. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony under an arch of autumn flowers that Flora had grown in her now thriving garden. Preston stood tall and proud in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Flora as she walked toward him in a modest white dress that Mrs. Stevens had helped her alter. The Ortiz brothers beamed like proud family members, and even the taciturn ranch hands from neighboring properties seemed moved by the simple beauty of the occasion. "I, Preston, take you, Flora, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Preston's voice rang clear and true across the yard. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Flora's heart swelled as she repeated the vows, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Preston bent to kiss her with tender reverence, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward was joyous, a feast prepared by Miguel and Javier, music from Eduardo's fiddle, dancing under the stars. Flora found herself passed from partner to partner as the neighboring men claimed their dances with the bride. But her eyes always sought out Preston, finding him watching her with undisguised adoration. When they finally retired to the ranch house, their home now, truly and legally, Preston swept her into his arms at the threshold, mindful of his still healing wound but insistent on observing tradition. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," he said as he carried her across the threshold. Flora wrapped her arms around his neck, happiness bubbling through her like the champagne someone had produced for the wedding toast. "I've been home since the day you found me in the desert," she confessed. "I just didn't know it yet." Preston's eyes darkened with emotion and desire. He set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it," he promised. That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Flora discovered new depths to her love for Preston. His hands were gentle yet sure, his kisses both reverent and passionate. He worshipped her body with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and when they finally joined as one, the sense of coming home was overwhelming. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Flora felt a peace she had never known before. The grief of losing her father would always be with her, as would the anger at the injustice of his death. But now those emotions were balanced by joy and hope, by the love of this good man and the future they would build together. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "The future," Flora replied honestly. "Our future." Preston pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And what do you see?" Flora smiled against his skin. "This ranch growing and prospering, children running through the garden, you and me growing old together on that porch." "And Blackwater?" Preston asked, his voice serious. He had told her about the confrontation at the Stevens Ranch, how the Blackwater men had retreated, but not before threatening to return in greater numbers. Flora sighed, the contentment of the moment dimmed slightly by reality. "They won't stop," she acknowledged. "Men like that never do." "No," Preston agreed. "But neither will we. The neighbors are talking about forming an association, strength in numbers. If we stand together, Blackwater will have a harder time picking us off one by one." Flora propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling in a curtain around them. "It could be dangerous," she said. Preston reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Most things worth fighting for are," he said simply. "But I promise you this, I won't take unnecessary risks. I have too much to live for now." The love in his eyes was so intense that Flora felt it like a physical force. She bent to kiss him, pouring all of her own love and commitment into the gesture. "We'll face it together," she said when they parted. "Whatever comes." Preston pulled her back into his arms, holding her close as sleep began to claim them both. "Together," he murmured. "Always." The first test of their unity came sooner than expected. Just 2 months after their wedding, as winter tightened its grip on the Nevada landscape, a rider from town brought news that Blackwater Mining Company had filed legal claims against several neighboring ranches, including the Double Q, alleging boundary disputes and water rights violations. "It's nonsense," Preston said, pacing the kitchen after the rider had departed. "Our boundaries are clear and our water rights have been established for years. My father purchased them legally when he established this ranch. But can you prove it?" Flora asked practically, already thinking of the legal battle ahead. Preston nodded. "The deeds are in the safe, but Blackwater has money for lawyers and the judge in Rhyolite is known to be sympathetic to mining interests." "Then we need to take this to a higher court," Flora said, her mind working quickly. "Perhaps in Carson City." Preston stopped pacing to look at her with admiration. "That's exactly what we need to do, but it will be expensive and time-consuming." "Then we'll pool resources," Flora said firmly. "The association you've been talking about, this is the perfect reason to formalize it. Each ranch contributes what they can, and we fight this together." Preston crossed the room to her, taking her hands in his. "You're remarkable, do you know that?" Flora smiled, squeezing his hands. "I'm practical, and I'll be damned if I'll lose another home to those vultures." Preston bent to kiss her, quick but fervent. "I'll ride to the Stevens place today, then on to the Johnsons. We'll call a meeting, get everyone together." Within a week, representatives from 12 ranches gathered in the Double Cuticus barn, converted for the occasion into a meeting hall with hay bales for seating and lanterns for light. The mood was grim but determined as Preston laid out what they knew of Blackwater's legal maneuvers. "They're trying to intimidate us, wear us down with legal costs until we give up and sell," he explained. "But if we stand together, pool our resources and our evidence, We have a chance of beating them in court." There were nods of agreement, though Flora could see the worry in many faces. These were hardworking people, not wealthy landowners. Legal battles could drain what little reserves they had. "What if they don't stop at legal action?" one of the ranchers asked, voicing what many were thinking. "Blackwater has hired guns. We've all heard the stories." Preston's expression hardened. "Then we prepare for that too. Each ranch should have at least 2 men who can handle firearms well. We establish signals, patterns of communication. If one ranch is threatened, others respond." More discussion followed, practical matters of money and organization, schedules for patrols, plans for gathering evidence against Blackwater. By the end of the night, the High Desert Ranchers Association was formally established, with Preston elected as its first president, and a treasury started with contributions from each member. As the last of the ranchers departed, promises of solidarity ringing in the frosty air, Flora found herself filled with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The path ahead would not be easy, but there was strength in their unity, hope in their collective resolve. Preston seemed to sense her conflicted emotions. He wrapped an arm around her waist as they stood in the doorway, watching the last riders disappear into the night. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. Flora leaned into his warmth, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "No," she said honestly. "Just realistic about what we're facing. Blackwater won't surrender easily." "No," Preston agreed, "but neither will we, and right is on our side." Flora smiled up at him, love and admiration warming her despite the winter chill. "My father would have said the same thing," she said softly. "He never backed down from a fight he believed in." Preston's arm tightened around her. "Then we'll make him proud," he promised. "And we'll build the future we talked about, the garden, the children growing old on that porch. Blackwater can't take that from us unless we let them." Flora rested her head against his shoulder, drawing strength from his confidence. "You're right," she said, "and we won't let them." The legal battle with Blackwater Mining Company stretched through the winter and into the spring. Flora threw herself into supporting the association's efforts, helping to organize documents, write letters, and keep accounts of their collective funds. The garden lay dormant under snow, but she made plans for spring planting, determined that life would go on despite the shadow hanging over their future. In April, Preston returned from a trip to Carson City with news that lifted their spirits. The territorial judge had agreed to hear their case, and Blackwater's local legal maneuvers would be stayed until the higher court made its ruling. "It's not a victory yet," Preston cautioned as they celebrated the news with the Ortiz brothers, "but it's a step in the right direction. It means Blackwater can't use the Rhyolite court to push us off our land, at least for now." "It buys us time," Flora agreed. "Time to strengthen our case, gather more evidence." The reprieve allowed them to focus on spring planting and the calving season that followed. The ranch thrived under their combined care. Flora's garden expanded to include not just vegetables but medicinal herbs and flowers, while Preston's careful breeding program resulted in stronger, healthier calves than the Double Q had seen in years. Life settled into a rhythm of hard work and simple pleasures. Flora found joy in creating a true home of the ranch house, adding curtains she had sewn herself, arranging wildflowers in jars on the table, baking bread in the kitchen where she and Preston would linger over coffee in the early mornings, planning their day. The nights were for passion and whispered confidences, for the deepening of a love that had blossomed in the most unexpected circumstances. In June, as the garden flourished and the calves grew strong on summer grass, Flora missed her monthly courses. She said nothing to Preston at first, wanting to be certain before raising his hopes. But by July, there was no doubt. She was carrying his child. She chose a perfect moment to tell him, a quiet evening on the porch, the work of the day done, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold over the distant mountains. Preston sat in his customary chair, hat tipped back, boots crossed at the ankle as he enjoyed a rare moment of rest. "I have something to tell you," Flora said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Preston glanced over at her, curious at her tone. "What is it, love?" Flora took a deep breath. "Come February, there will be 3 of us sitting on this porch." For a moment, Preston looked confused, then understanding dawned, spreading across his face like the sunrise. "Flora," he breathed, uncrossing his legs and sitting up straight. "Are you saying?" She nodded, unable to contain her smile any longer. "I'm with child, Preston, your child." Preston was on his feet in an instant, crossing to kneel before her chair. His hands trembled slightly as they covered hers. "A baby," he said, awe in his voice. "Our baby." Flora had never seen such joy on his face, not even on their wedding day. He looked younger somehow, unburdened by the weight of responsibility he usually carried. "Are you pleased?" she asked, though the answer was written clearly in his expression. Preston laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "Pleased, Flora, I'm—" Words seemed to fail him. Instead, he rose to pull her gently to her feet and into his arms. His kiss was tender, reverent, his hands cradling her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When they parted, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Thank you," he whispered. "For this gift, for our future, for everything you are." Flora felt tears of her own welling up. "It's we who have created this gift," she reminded him, taking one of his hands and placing it over her still flat abdomen. "Together." Preston's expression sobered slightly, though the joy remained in his eyes. "I promise you, Flora, I will do everything in my power to make this world safe for our child. Blackwater, or anyone else who threatens what's ours, they'll have to go through me." The protective fierceness in his voice made Flora's heart swell with love. "I know," she said softly, "and that's why I have no fear for our future, whatever challenges it holds." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Preston's hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew, Flora thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the tragedy of her father's death and the loss of her childhood home, to finding love and creating new life with Preston, it was a path she could never have imagined in those dark days of flight and fear. "What are you thinking?" Preston murmured, sensing her wakefulness. Flora turned in his arms to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the darkness. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best," she said. "If Blackwater hadn't forced me from my home, I would never have found you." Preston was quiet for a moment, his hand gently stroking her back. "I've thought the same thing," he admitted. "It feels wrong to be grateful for something that caused you such pain, but I can't help but thank God every day that you came into my life." Flora nestled closer to him, drawing comfort from his warmth. "It's not wrong," she assured him. "It's finding meaning in suffering, purpose in pain, and that's how we heal, I think." Preston pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're wise beyond your years, Mrs. Quinn." Flora smiled against his chest. "Not wise," she corrected. "Just learning, day by day, what truly matters." What truly mattered became crystal clear in the months that followed, as Flora's body changed to accommodate the growing life within her. The legal battle with Blackwater continued in the background, depositions given, evidence collected, lawyers consulted, but the immediate focus of the Double Q was preparation for the coming child. Preston threw himself into readying a nursery, converting a small room adjacent to their bedroom with the help of Javier, who proved to be surprisingly skilled at carpentry. A cradle took shape under his hands, lovingly crafted from pine harvested from the hills behind the ranch. Miguel's wife, who visited regularly from her home in the nearby settlement, brought baby clothes she had sewn and advice for the expectant mother. Winter settled over the ranch once more, but this time it brought anticipation rather than dread. Flora continued to work as her pregnancy advanced, though Preston and the Ortiz brothers insisted she take on lighter duties. Her garden lay dormant under snow again, but she spent hours planning the spring planting, imagining a child old enough to toddle alongside her as she tended the vegetables and flowers. February arrived with bitter cold and heavy snows that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Preston grew increasingly anxious as Flora's time drew near, worried about getting help if complications arose. But Flora remained calm, trusting in her body's natural wisdom and the skills she had learned from her mother and other women over the years. On the night of February 15th, 1877, as a full moon illuminated the snow-covered landscape, Flora's labor began. Preston sent Javier riding through the storm to fetch the midwife from the nearest settlement, while Miguel boiled water and prepared the bedroom according to Flora's instructions. The labor was long and difficult. Flora drew on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, encouraged by Preston, who never left her side, his face etched with concern and love as he held her hand through each contraction. The midwife arrived just before dawn, bringing experienced hands and calming words that helped Flora through the final, most challenging hours. As the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, Flora gave one final, mighty push, and their son entered the world with a robust cry that seemed to fill the entire house. A boy. The midwife announced, quickly wiping the squalling infant clean before placing him on Flora's chest. And a strong one at that. Flora gazed down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He was perfect, a thatch of dark hair like his father's, tiny fists waving in protest at the shock of birth, his newborn eyes squinting against the light. "Thomas," she whispered, looking up at Preston, who stood beside the bed, his own eyes wet with emotion. "After my father, Thomas Quinn." Preston nodded, his throat working as he struggled to contain his feelings. "Thomas," he agreed, his voice rough. He reached out a tentative finger to touch his son's tiny hand, marveling when the baby reflexively gripped it. "He's strong," Preston said, wonder and pride mingling in his voice. "Like his mother." Flora smiled tiredly. "And his father." The midwife supervised the final stages of the birth process, ensuring that both mother and baby were healthy before instructing Preston on how to care for them in the days to come. When she finally departed, leaving the new family alone, Preston settled on the edge of the bed, his gaze moving between Flora and their son with undisguised adoration. "I never knew it was possible to love this much," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like my heart has doubled in size." Flora understood exactly what he meant. The love she felt for their child was overwhelming, all-consuming, unlike anything she had experienced before. It was both fierce and tender, protective and hopeful. "This is what we're fighting for," she said softly, adjusting Thomas against her breast as he began to root for nourishment. "This is why Blackwater can't win." Preston's expression hardened with resolve. "They won't," he promised. "Our son will grow up secure in his home, proud of his heritage. The double Q will be his legacy, as it should be." As spring thawed the frozen landscape, bringing new life to the ranch, news arrived from Carson City. The territorial judge had ruled in favor of the High Desert Ranchers Association, invalidating Blackwater's claims to their lands and water rights. It was a significant victory, though Preston cautioned that it might not be the end of their troubles. Blackwater has money and influence, he reminded the jubilant association members at a celebratory gathering. They may appeal to higher courts, or they may try other tactics. We must remain vigilant. But for the moment, at least, they could breathe easier. The immediate threat had been averted and the future looked brighter than it had in months. The ranchers toasted their success, their unity, and the leadership that had brought them through the crisis. Later that night, as Preston and Flora sat on their porch, 3-month-old Thomas sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, Preston reflected on how much had changed in the span of a year. "Last spring, you were just beginning to make the garden your own," he said. "Now look at us, legal victory behind us, son in our arms, future ahead of us." Flora smiled, looking down at Thomas's peaceful face. "And to think it all began with a blanket in the desert," she mused. "If you hadn't found me that night." Preston reached over to take her hand, his expression serious. "I believe we were meant to find each other, Flora. Call it fate, call it God's plan. I don't think it was chance that brought us together." Flora squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. From the tragedy of her father's death, to her desperate flight across the desert, to Preston's timely appearance with a blanket and an offer of shelter, it seemed too perfectly orchestrated to be mere coincidence. "Whatever force brought us together," she said, "I'm grateful for it every day." Preston leaned over to kiss her, then gently brushed his lips against his son's forehead. "As am I," he murmured. "As am I." The following years brought both challenges and joys to the Quinn family. Blackwater Mining Company, as Preston had predicted, did not surrender easily. They appealed the territorial court's decision, dragging the legal battle out for another 2 years. But the High Desert Ranchers Association held firm, their unity unbroken, their resolve strengthened by each attempt to divide them. Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, his sturdy legs carrying him around the garden as Flora had once imagined, his curious hands touching everything within reach. He had his father's dark hair and strong build, but Flora's expressive eyes and quick smile. He was the light of their lives, the center around which the ranch revolved. When Thomas was 3, the final legal verdict came down. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear Blackwater's appeal, effectively ending their claims once and for all. The celebration at the Double Q lasted well into the night, with ranchers from miles around gathering to mark the end of a struggle that had consumed so much of their energy and resources. "We did it," Preston said, raising a toast to the assembled crowd. "Together, we stood against those who would take what's ours, and we prevailed." There were cheers and applause, but Flora, standing at his side with Thomas on her hip, saw the weariness behind Preston's smile. The fight had taken its toll on him: countless trips to Carson City, endless meetings and strategy sessions, the constant worry of protecting not just his own family, but all those who had placed their trust in him. That night, after the guests had departed and Thomas was tucked into bed, Flora found Preston sitting on the porch, staring out at the stars. "It's really over," she said, settling into the chair beside his. Preston nodded, reaching for her hand. "For now, at least. Blackwater may have lost interest in our water rights, but there will be others. The West is changing, Flora. The open range, the small rancher, I wonder sometimes how long it can last." Flora heard the melancholy in his voice and understood it. Preston was a man of tradition, of values formed in a time when a person's word was their bond and land was not just property but heritage. "Whatever comes," she said firmly, "we'll face it together. And we'll teach Thomas to face it too, with the same courage and integrity his father has shown." Preston's expression softened as he looked at her. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" Flora smiled. "You have, but I never tire of hearing it." Preston pulled her from her chair into his lap, wrapping his arms around her. "I love you, Flora Quinn, more with each passing day." Flora leaned into his embrace, savoring the feeling of security and belonging that had become her constant companion since that night in the desert. "And I love you, Preston Quinn, now and always." They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, the future stretching before them like the vast Nevada sky full of possibilities, challenges, and hope. In the years that followed, the Double Q prospered under their care. Flora's garden expanded into a small commercial operation, supplying vegetables and medicinal herbs to Rhyolite and neighboring settlements. Preston's cattle breeding program gained recognition throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as California. Thomas was joined by a sister, Margaret, born on a warm summer night in 1882, and then by another brother, William, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm in 1885. The Quinn children grew up surrounded by love and the values their parents held dear: hard work, honesty, respect for the land and all who lived on it. As the century drew to a close, the West did indeed change as Preston had predicted. Railroads brought more settlers, towns grew into cities, and the open range gradually gave way to fenced properties and larger cattle operations. But the Double Q adapted and survived, as did many of the ranches that had stood together against Blackwater so many years before. In 1897, on the 20th anniversary of their marriage, Preston and Flora sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching their children and grandchildren play in the yard where their wedding had taken place. Thomas, now a strapping young man of 20, had recently married a schoolteacher from Rhyolite and was building a home of his own on a corner of the Double Q land. Margaret, 15 and as practical as her mother, was already showing a talent for ranch management that promised well for the future. And William, 12 and adventurous, had his father's way with horses and his mother's love of growing things. "Did you ever imagine this?" Preston asked, his hair now streaked with gray but his eyes as bright and clear as they had been when Flora first met him. "That night when you found me in the desert, did you ever think we'd have all this?" Flora smiled, her hand finding his as it had countless times over the years. "No," she admitted. "In those dark days, I couldn't see beyond survival. You gave me more than shelter that night, Preston. You gave me hope." Preston lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding night. "And you gave me purpose," he said. "A reason to build, to protect, to persevere." They fell into comfortable silence, watching as the sun began to set, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, a haven they had created together from adversity and love. "You remember what you told me the night Thomas was born?" Preston asked after a while. "You said that our family, our home, was what we were fighting for." Flora nodded, the memory as clear as if it had been yesterday. "And we won that fight," she said softly. "Not just against Blackwater, but against all the doubts and fears that might have kept us from building this life." Preston smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way that still made Flora's heart skip a beat. "We did it that," he agreed, "and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." Flora leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that the broken ranch she had fled so many years ago had led her, by paths she could never have foreseen, to this moment of perfect peace. The cowboy who had brought her a blanket and offered shelter for the night had become her husband, her partner, the father of her children, the cornerstone of a life more blessed than she had ever dared to dream. "So would I," she whispered, "every step of the way." And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Flora knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the new century might bring, the love that had begun on that desperate night in the Nevada desert would endure, as steadfast and eternal as the land itself.